Laura O'Malley was just 13 years old when she vanished from her home in Long Beach, New York, in late August 1975. According to contemporary reports, she had run away after significant tensions at home. She left a message saying she wouldn't return as long as her stepfather was living with the family. About a year after she disappeared, Laura's mother and stepfather separated, and her family pleaded publicly for the girl to come home. Unfortunately, those pleas went unanswered, and New York missing persons detectives chased countless leads in the late 1970s. Laura's siblings never gave up either. They spent years circulating her photo around NYC, believing she might have fled to the city and hoping someone had seen her. Despite these efforts, no trace of Laura O'Malley was found. 20 years after Laura's disappearance on March 22, 1995, a shocking discovery was made on the opposite side of the country. Partial skeletal remains of a young female were found in a remote riverbed off Highway 129 near Watsonville in Santa Cruz County, California. Investigators at the scene noted the bones were badly weathered and initially suspected they might not be related to any recent crime at all. In fact, early on it was theorized to be a homestead burial, the remains of someone laid to rest on family land long ago. Because of this assumption that the bones were historic rather than an active case, forensic analysis at the time was limited. However, despite this, authorities did perform a standard DNA test on the remains, which confirmed they belonged to an unidentified female and didn't match any known profile. The initial misclassification as a historical burial meant precious time was lost before realizing a crime might have occurred. It wasn't until 2019, nearly 24 years after the discovery, that the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office decided to take a fresh look at the case. Investigators sent the remains for advanced forensic testing, including radiocarbon dating. The results were eye-opening. They indicated that the unknown girl was likely born in the mid-1960s and had died sometime between 1977 and 1984. This firmly placed her death in the late 20th century, not a century or more ago, prompting detectives to reclassify the case as an active cold case homicide investigation. The age of the victim at death was estimated to be in her mid-teens, roughly 13 to 17 years old. Over the years, investigators and amateur sleuths tried to connect the Santa Cruz Jane Doe with missing persons reports from the 1970s and 1980s. Was she a runaway from California, a hitchhiker passing through, or perhaps a victim of foul play dumped by the highway? With no identifying documents or personal items recovered, numerous theories surfaced about her identity and how she died. One early theory, after the 2019 testing, was that she could have been a hitchhiker or transient who suffered an accident near the river. However, foul play couldn't be ruled out. Meanwhile, for the O'Malley family back on the other side of the nation, the decades had continued to pass with no answers. Laura's whereabouts and condition remained unknown, and the California investigators had no idea their Jane Doe was a girl who had disappeared from New York. A breakthrough finally came in the 2020s, thanks to emerging forensic genealogy technology. In 2022, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram to try to identify the long-lost Jane Doe. Using forensic genetic genealogy, scientists were able to extract a comprehensive DNA profile from the girl's degraded remains. Investigators on the ground followed these leads to locate living family members of the Jane Doe and obtained reference DNA samples from them. Finally, nearly 30 years after the remains were found, and almost 50 years after Laura O'Malley had vanished, the pieces lined up. In March 2025, officials announced that the once mysterious remains had been positively identified as Laura Ann O'Malley. Laura's case is now officially closed as a missing person case. but it has transitioned into a new phase. Police in California admit they still don't know exactly when or how Laura arrived in Santa Cruz County, or how she lost her life there. Those details remain the final mystery. Authorities are continuing to gather information. At present, they're appealing to the public for anyone who might remember encountering a young girl from New York and California in the late 1970s. The hope is that this identification will eventually lead to justice, or at least a fuller story of what happened to Laura. And while this is just speculation on my part, I would hope that the authorities are conducting a full investigation of the stepfather, who may very well still be alive. Edna Schubert, an 88-year-old widow from North Bay Shore, Long Island, was found brutally slain in her home on December 12, 2003. Concerned neighbors had noticed her front door left ajar and a window shattered, prompting them to check on her welfare. The victim was a retired Department of Motor Vehicles employee who had lived alone since her husband's passing years earlier. She had no children of her own, but was a beloved figure on her street, affectionately known as the grandma of the neighborhood for her kindness toward local kids. Simply put, she was the sort of neighbor everyone wanted to have, and that everyone cared about. Or at least that's what one would assume, isn't it? Suffolk County detectives launched an extensive investigation in the aftermath of Schubert's slaying. Crime scene specialists carefully documented the scene and collected every piece of evidence they could find, including latent fingerprints and blood samples left by the intruder. Despite these efforts, no suspect was identified in 2003. Unsurprisingly, Edna Schubert had no known enemies, and there were no obvious suspects. Early forensic tests failed to match the fingerprints or DNA to any known offender in law enforcement databases, leaving investigators without a viable target. As weeks turned into months and then years, the trail grew cold. The case that had once gripped Long Island gradually faded from headlines, but it was never forgotten by the authorities. By the late 2000s, the slaying of Edna Schubert had become one of the region's most notorious unsolved crimes. As the 20th anniversary of the crime approached, the file on Edna Schubert remained dusty and unresolved, much to the dismay of the community and the authorities. However, in 2023, a spark of hope arrived from a detective who refused to let the case die. Retired Suffolk County Police Detective Pat Albergo, one of the original investigators, contacted the department's cold case unit. He urged them to take a fresh look at the evidence using modern forensic technology, which he believed was the key to cracking the case. Albergo's persistence set in motion a long overdue re-examination of the clues preserved since 2003. Detective Brendan O'Hara reopened the investigation and teamed up with retired fingerprint expert Detective Timothy Kelly to pore over the old evidence. They focused on a latent fingerprint that had been lifted from the crime scene years ago, which initially had been deemed too blurred to yield a match. Using advanced high-definition upscaling, the investigators took a new, high-resolution photograph of the old fingerprint and ran it through a state-of-the-art fingerprint database. And yeah, this stuff was basically science fiction 22 years ago when the crime occurred. It was basically something you'd see on an episode of CSI, but now it's reality. This time, the result was very different. The print came back as a match to a man named Raul Ayala, a known criminal, confirming a major breakthrough in the case. The suspect turned out to have been in law enforcement records already. Interestingly, Ayala's fingerprints were on file from a prior arrest, years before Edna's slaying, but the forensic tech just wasn't where it is today. With Raul Ayala now identified as a prime suspect, investigators dug into his background. They discovered that Ayala had actually been Schubert's neighbor back in 2003. He lived roughly 200 yards from her home at the time of the slaying. Not long after the crime, Ayala left New York and eventually settled in the small town of Talmo, Georgia. Detectives now needed enough hard evidence to secure an arrest and conviction, since the fingerprint alone wasn't enough to guarantee conviction. The team turned back to the biological evidence from the scene. The bloodstains on Schubert's clothing had been preserved, and the DNA had been tested before, but that had never led to an identification. Using updated DNA analysis tools, the Suffolk County Crime Lab confirmed those stains contained a mixture of Edna's blood and DNA from an unknown male perpetrator. Armed with this knowledge, police organized a covert plan to verify Ayala's DNA. In August 2024, Suffolk County detectives traveled to Georgia to discreetly obtain a sample of Ayala's DNA for comparison. Investigators finally closed in on him. They kept Ayala under surveillance and collected items he discarded in the trash. These items included lottery scratch-off tickets and plastic bottles used to gather his DNA without tipping him off. Back in New York, forensic analysts found that DNA from a tossed-out Gatorade bottle matched the unidentified male DNA from the 2003 crime scene. This conclusively provided a link between Ayala and Schubert on the day in question. At last, with the forensic evidence firmly in hand, authorities moved to take Raul Ayala into custody. On January 16, 2025, Suffolk County Police detectives, aided by local Georgia deputies, arrested the 51-year-old Ayala at his residence in Talmo, Georgia. The suspect was then transported back to New York to face justice after more than 20 years living freely after the crime. On February 7, 2025, Ayala was formally indicted in a Suffolk County courtroom on a number of counts related to Edna Schubert's slaying. During a packed arraignment proceeding, Ayala pleaded not guilty and was ordered held without bail by the judge, given the severity of the case. If convicted on the charge, Raul Ayala faces a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of now, it's unclear if the prosecution has any idea why they believe Ayala perpetrated this horrific act on a sweet old woman, but I suspect we may find out soon enough. Ayala remains innocent of all charges until he's proven guilty in a court of law. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, with a quick reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Also remember to check out my other channels, Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill History, for unsolved mysteries and historical content, respectively. On a Sunday morning in December 1982, a real estate agent surveying a tract of land in Loxahatchee, Florida, stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Scattered human remains were found strewn in a wooded area about 140 yards off a remote road. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office responded and determined the victim was a woman who had been shot in the head. The remains were badly decomposed, likely the result of being exposed to the elements and animal activity, with bones found along the gravel roadway and in the brush. Investigators had little to go on besides the skeletal remains and a few personal items left at the scene. A number of pieces of jewelry were recovered with the victim, some of which were highly distinctive. These included a wristwatch, a gold necklace with an anchor pendant and a key pendant, and 2 rings, one in a small silver heart shape, and the other a gold ring set with 4 gemstone pieces. One of the rings was speculated to have been a wedding or engagement ring. These belongings, along with evidence from an autopsy suggesting the woman had given birth a number of times, led detectives to nickname her the Jeweled Mom. Despite the intimate and possibly distinctive nature of the jewelry, no immediate identification could be made. Forensic experts determined the victim was a white female, estimated to be between 25 to 40 years old and around 5 feet tall with brown hair. She had signs of a past back injury and even traces of pink frosted nail polish on her fingernails, suggesting she took care of her appearance. A forensic dentist charted her dental work, which included crowns, fillings, and extractions, and circulated the chart to over 2,000 dentists across Florida in hopes of finding a match. Unfortunately, despite this significant effort, no leads emerged from the dental records or any other of her distinctive features. From the start, it was clear this was a slaying, but the victim's identity and the perpetrator remained a mystery. In 2013, a sample from the woman's femur was submitted for DNA analysis in another attempt to identify her, again without success. All the while, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office kept the case open and in the public eye. The unsolved case in Loxahatchee didn't exist in a vacuum. In May 1982, just months before the jeweled mom was found, another set of female remains had been discovered in the same general area. Those remains, later identified as 17-year-old Tina Marie Beebe, were found in a shallow grave not far from a property owned by Christopher Wilder, an infamous serial predator. Wilder, dubbed the Beauty Queen Killer, would go on to abduct and slay at least 8 young women in a cross-country crime spree in 1984. Given the proximity of the 1982 Loxahatchee crime scene to Wilder's land, investigators eventually took notice. They suspected that the unidentified jeweled mom might have been an earlier victim of Wilder. Wilder's known victims were generally younger women, teens and 20s, and he died in 1984 during a shootout with police, never confessing to any crimes beyond those known. Nonetheless, the possibility of his involvement in this 1982 case lingered as an unsettling theory, but I'll come back to this shortly. Investigators also kept an open mind that the perpetrator could have been someone else entirely. Given that she wore what appeared to be a wedding ring, detectives also considered any potential spouse as a prime suspect. By the 2020s, forensic science had advanced dramatically, offering new hope for the Loxahatchee Jane Doe. In 2021, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram, a private laboratory specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, to finally crack the identity of the jeweled mom. Using trace evidence from the remains that had been preserved, Othram scientists were able to extract DNA and build a comprehensive genetic profile. It was then used in genealogical databases to find familial connections. The process generated leads to a particular family, and investigators then conducted some good old-fashioned police work. They interviewed potential family members identified through the DNA matches and obtained a reference DNA sample from one relative. Eventually, by comparing that relative's DNA to the unknown victim's profile, they achieved a conclusive match. In late 2022, after 39 years of anonymity, the sheriff's office received the news it had been chasing. The jeweled mom Jane Doe's identity was confirmed. She was Leona Jean Keller, born on December 13, 1945, and 37 years old at the time she was slain. Originally from Pennsylvania, Leona had married and lived in South Florida in the 1970s. She was a married mother of 4, whose family members had reported her missing long ago. However, for reasons that aren't yet fully understood, the missing persons report and the Jane Doe case were never connected at the time. Yet the identification, while a milestone, is only one chapter of the story. The biggest question remains unanswered. Who was responsible for her death and why? Leona's remains were discovered close to property Christopher Wilder owned. His violent methodology, often involving remote disposal sites close to where Keller's remains were found, very closely matched this crime. Combined with the circumstantial evidence about Wilder, this strongly suggests that this isn't a situation where the spouse or a close personal associate was involved. That said, there is one thing that makes me believe that it could have potentially been someone other than Wilder. Leona was 39, and the vast majority of Wilder's victims fell in the late teens to early 20s range, with only one confirmed victim in her early 30s. On a quiet morning in September 2018, a telephone technician working behind a vacant house on Detroit's east side made a grim discovery. In the overgrown backyard of a rundown property on Camden Street, the worker stumbled upon what looked like a human skull. Detroit police were called to the scene, where they confirmed the presence of skeletal human remains. Scattered bones and a skull lay hidden behind the empty home, telling a silent story of a life cut short. Investigators quickly determined the remains belonged to a young woman. However, there was no identification, no purse or ID left behind, just bones. The question that loomed over the scene was obvious. Who was she? And what happened to her? The Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office took custody of the remains and began trying to piece together the story. Forensic experts estimated the victim was a black female, likely between 18 and 22 years old at the time of death. She was tall, and investigators believed that she may have stood 6'1", an uncommon stature that investigators hoped might stand out in missing person reports. The medical examiner looked for any signs of trauma or foul play on the bones. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, it was difficult to determine an exact cause of death from the skeletal remains alone. Police searched the area for any other evidence and checked missing persons databases for young women who fit the description. The case was entered into the Name Us database as an unidentified female, and she became another Jane Doe from Detroit. Leads were scarce, and months turned into years with no match for the unknown woman. One early theory focused on a known missing person, Jasmine Moody, a 19-year-old college student from Texas who had vanished in Detroit in 2014. Jasmine's disappearance had haunted her family and the authorities for years, and some wondered if this Jane Doe was her. However, DNA comparisons and dental records eventually ruled out Jasmine Moody as the unidentified victim. Other names of missing young women were considered and eliminated as well, and with each passing year, the trail grew colder. For more than 6 years, the young woman's identity and story remained unknown. Her skull and bones sat in storage at the medical examiner's office while her case file gathered dust in the Detroit Police Department's cold case unit. Investigators periodically revisited the file, hoping new information or technology might shed light on who she was. By 2023, the Detroit Police Department decided to try a new approach that has started solving cold cases around the country. At this point in the video, I'm sure you can guess what it was. But if you can't, yeah, it was forensic genetic genealogy again. In late 2023 and early 2024, this painstaking research finally yielded a promising lead. A possible relative of the Jane Doe had been identified. Detectives reached out and located this family member, explaining the situation. The relative agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison, which would lead to a major breakthrough. In March 2025, nearly 7 years after her remains were first found, the Detroit Police Department announced a major development. Yet another Jane Doe had her identity restored at last thanks to forensic genealogy. The skeletal remains were conclusively identified as Tiffany Tillmon, a 26-year-old woman who had likely died around late 2017 or 2018. Tiffany Tillmon was born on February 8, 1992, and would have been in her mid-20s at the time of her disappearance and death. While identifying Tiffany Tillmon marked a huge step forward, the case was far from fully solved. With her identity known, the investigation is now shifting focus to how Tiffany died, and who, if anyone, was responsible. As of now, the authorities have not yet announced a cause of death in Tiffany's case, or whether they had any suspects in mind. The circumstances of her body's discovery, hidden behind a vacant house, strongly suggests that something sinister could have happened.